She had my husband's unmarked bureau vehicle towed off our own driveway while he was inside finishing a federal wiretap authorization call, and she filmed the whole thing for her HOA Facebook group with the caption, "Finally towing the eyesores off Birchwood Court." She did not know that the man whose truck she just had hauled away on a flatbed was 40 minutes from briefing 2 U.S. attorneys on an active organized fraud investigation. What would you do if an HOA president towed a federal agent's vehicle without checking what it actually was first? Drop your state below. Let's see where my undercover justice family is watching from. My name's Diane Castellano. 47 years old, hospital pharmacist, married 11 years to a man named Rourke Castellano, who most of our neighbors knew, when they knew anything about him at all, as the quiet guy who works some kind of insurance job and travels a lot. That was the cover story we'd settled on years ago, the kind of vague, boring explanation that makes neighbors stop asking follow-up questions within about 30 seconds. Rourke is, and has been for 16 years, a special agent with the FBI, currently assigned to a multi-state financial crimes task force. I'm not going to pretend I can tell you every detail of what he does day to day, because I genuinely don't always know, and because some of what I do know I'm not supposed to repeat, even on a video like this one. What I can tell you is that the vehicle Marlene Diggs had towed off our driveway on a Thursday afternoon in March was an unmarked bureau-issued surveillance vehicle, registered to a federal fleet account, currently assigned to my husband for an active investigation that, as it turned out, involved several residents of our own state, though thankfully none of them lived in Birchwood Court. We bought our house in Birchwood Court Estates 4 years ago, a quiet cul-de-sac community of maybe 60 homes outside the city, picked specifically because it was unremarkable in every way that mattered to us. No gate, no clubhouse, nothing that would draw attention. Rourke's job requires a level of operational security in his personal life that most people never think about, things like never parking the same vehicle in the same configuration twice, never discussing his actual caseload anywhere that isn't cleared for it, and absolutely never, under any circumstances, drawing attention to the vehicles assigned to him for fieldwork. That last rule is the one Marlene Diggs blew apart without having the faintest idea what she was doing. Marlene moved into Birchwood Court 18 months ago and was elected HOA president within her first 6 months, a swift rise she achieved, as far as I could tell, through sheer relentless attendance at every single board meeting combined with a campaign platform built almost entirely around what she called restoring order to a neighborhood that's let its standards slip. I want to be fair here, the same way I think most people telling these stories should be fair, and acknowledge that some HOA presidents genuinely do care about reasonable upkeep standards. Marlene was not interested in reasonable standards. Marlene was interested in control, and she found it, almost immediately, in targeting the one vehicle in the neighborhood that nobody could explain to her satisfaction. Rourke's assigned vehicle changed every few months depending on the case, standard bureau practice for agents doing surveillance-adjacent work, but for about 5 months that spring, it had been a plain gray Ford sedan with government plates that, to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at, looked like nothing more than an unremarkable rental car. It usually sat in our driveway overnight and left early most mornings, sometimes returning at odd hours, sometimes not returning at all for 2 or 3 days depending on what Rourke's assignment required. Marlene noticed the vehicle within her first month as president. She mentioned it at a board meeting in January, according to the minutes I'd later request, describing it as a suspicious unregistered vehicle with no resident decal, parked overnight in violation of community parking guidelines. I want to note here that Birchwood Court's actual parking guidelines, which I read in full once this whole mess started, said nothing whatsoever about resident decals, a requirement that, as far as anyone on the original HOA board could determine, Marlene had simply invented. She started leaving notes on the windshield. Small, polite-sounding ones. At first, the kind that ask you to, please register your vehicle with the HOA office, which I ignored, partly because I genuinely didn't think much of it and partly because Rourke had told me years earlier, in that calm, practiced tone he uses for exactly these situations, that the less attention we drew to questions about his vehicles, the better, and that ignoring a low-stakes HOA note was almost always the right call compared to explaining anything. The notes escalated through February. A formal violation notice, citing a fabricated decal requirement, threatening a $75 fine. I still ignored it, mostly out of the same instinct, though I'll admit I was starting to find it more annoying than I let on to Rourke, who was deep in a stretch of long, unpredictable hours that spring and genuinely didn't have the bandwidth to think about a parking dispute. By early March, Marlene had escalated to what she described, in a particularly theatrical Facebook post I'd later screenshot for entirely different reasons, as Operation Clean Court, a self-declared initiative to remove what she called non-compliant, possibly abandoned, possibly criminal vehicles, from the neighborhood. The post included a blurry photo of Rourke's gray sedan, license plate circled in red, with a caption asking neighbors to keep an eye on this vehicle and report any suspicious activity. I found out about that post from our actual neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Phyllis Okonjo who lived 2 doors down and had become genuinely concerned, in a kind way, that we might be dealing with some kind of stalker or harassment situation given how Marlene was describing the car. "Diane, honey, is everything all right? That woman's been telling people your car might belong to a criminal." I laughed it off at the time, told Phyllis it was just Rourke's work vehicle and not to worry about it, the same deflection I'd used for years on anyone who asked too many questions. I genuinely didn't think Marlene would escalate beyond posting and fining. I was wrong about that, the same way I think a lot of people in these situations are wrong right up until the moment someone like Marlene actually follows through on something they assumed was an empty threat. On a Thursday afternoon in mid-March, Rourke came home between field assignments to handle some paperwork and make a series of calls from our home office, a secure setup we'd had installed years earlier specifically for exactly this kind of work-from-home stretch. He pulled the gray sedan into our driveway around 11 in the morning. By 2 in the afternoon, while he was on a call with 2 assistant U.S. attorneys finalizing language for a wiretap authorization request connected to an ongoing financial fraud investigation, a tow truck Marlene had personally called and personally directed, standing in our driveway in workout leggings and a visor, supervising the entire operation, hooked up his vehicle and hauled it away. I wasn't home. I was finishing a shift at the hospital pharmacy. I found out from a text message from Phyllis, who'd watched the entire thing happen from her porch and sent me a photo of the tow truck pulling out of our driveway with the caption, "Diane, what on earth is going on? That HOA woman just had your car towed and she's out there filming herself talking about it." I called Rourke immediately. He picked up sounding distracted, mid-paperwork, and I explained what Phyllis had told me. There was a pause on the line, the particular kind of pause I'd learned over 11 years of marriage. Meant he was recalculating something important in real time. "Diane, that vehicle has equipment in it that absolutely cannot end up in a random tow yard's inventory system. I need you to stay calm, and I need you to not contact this woman directly. I'm handling this through official channels starting right now." What Rourke didn't tell me on that first phone call, and what I only learned in pieces over the following days, was just how serious a complication this actually was for his ongoing case. The vehicle wasn't just a car. It contained secured surveillance equipment, case-related documentation locked in a hidden compartment, and a GPS tracking module tied to a separate, entirely unrelated piece of the financial fraud investigation he'd been running for the better part of a year. The moment that vehicle left our driveway on a flatbed, it created what Rourke later described to me. Once he was finally able to talk about it in general terms, as a chain of custody nightmare that legal counsel was going to have very pointed questions about. He made 2 calls before he called the towing company directly. The first was to his supervisor, a special agent in charge named Teresa Vance, explaining the situation and requesting immediate retrieval coordination. The second was to the Bureau's regional legal counsel office, because any scenario involving Bureau equipment and a private tow company immediately raised questions about evidence integrity that needed to be documented properly from the very first minute, regardless of how mundane the underlying cause turned out to be. The towing company, a local outfit called Crestline Towing and Recovery, had no idea what they'd actually picked up. Their dispatcher, a young guy named Marcus who I'd later hear about secondhand through Rourke's retelling, had simply processed it as a standard HOA-authorized removal, the kind of routine job his company did several times a month for various neighborhood associations in the area. The vehicle sat in their secured lot for approximately 90 minutes before two agents from Rourke's field office, dispatched directly by Teresa Vance, arrived with federal credentials and retrieval paperwork that, according to Rourke, made the lot manager go visibly pale within about 30 seconds of reading it. I want to be clear about something here, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. Rourke's case wasn't compromised in any permanent way. The equipment was secured, the chain of custody was documented and ultimately defensible, and the actual investigation continued without any material setback once the immediate retrieval was handled. But the incident itself triggered a formal incident report within the field office, the kind of report that exists specifically to document exactly how and why federal property ended up in the hands of a private towing company because a homeowners association president decided, on her own authority, that an unmarked sedan looked suspicious enough to remove from a residential driveway without any actual legal basis for doing so. Marlene, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. As far as she knew, she'd successfully executed the first major victory of her Operation Clean Court initiative, and she spent that Thursday evening doing exactly what I'd later learn was completely characteristic of her entire approach to the HOA presidency, documenting it extensively for an audience. Her Facebook post that evening, which I screenshotted within an hour of seeing it after Phyllis sent me the link, read in part, Birchwood Court residents, I'm thrilled to announce the successful removal of a long-standing parking violation on Birchwood Court Drive. This vehicle had been parked illegally, without proper registration, for months despite repeated notices. As your HOA president, I take community standards seriously, and I won't hesitate to take decisive action when residents ignore the rules that keep our neighborhood safe and beautiful. The post included 3 photos, the tow truck hooking up the vehicle, Marlene standing triumphantly in front of it with her arms crossed, and a final shot of the empty driveway with the caption, "Mission accomplished." The post had, by the time I saw it that evening, accumulated 47 comments, the overwhelming majority supportive, several specifically praising Marlene's tough leadership and no-nonsense approach to keeping our community looking its best. A handful of comments, including one from Phyllis, expressed concern about whether this had been handled appropriately, but those were quickly drowned out by Marlene's more enthusiastic supporters. Rourke came home that night close to 9, exhausted in a way that went beyond his usual long-day tiredness, the particular exhaustion of someone who spent an afternoon doing damage control on something that should never have needed damage control in the first place. He sat at our kitchen table, still in his work clothes, and told me, in the careful, general terms he always used when discussing anything case-adjacent, that the vehicle was secured, that the situation was being handled through appropriate channels, and that I shouldn't engage with Marlene directly under any circumstances until he'd had a chance to figure out exactly how this needed to play out. Diane, I need you to understand something. This isn't really about the car anymore. The car's fine, the equipment's fine, the case is fine. What this is actually about now is that a private citizen, acting entirely outside any legal authority she actually has, interfered with active federal law enforcement operations and then publicized it as a personal achievement to dozens of her neighbors. That's not a parking dispute. That's a problem that needs to be addressed properly, through the right people, not through me showing up at her door and explaining who I am. What does "addressed properly" mean? It means I'm going to loop in our field office's legal counsel, and they're going to make a determination about whether this rises to a level requiring formal action, separate from anything happening at the HOA level. It also means you and I are probably going to have a very awkward conversation with this woman at some point, but it's going to happen on terms we control, not terms she controls. That conversation didn't happen for another 9 days, mostly because Rourke was juggling the fallout from the towing incident alongside the actual case that had brought him home in the first place. Entirely fabricated, referencing no actual provision in the HOA's governing documents. She also, we learned through Phyllis and another neighbor, began telling people at a community coffee event that the vehicle had likely belonged to someone involved in something shady, speculating openly, without any basis whatsoever, that we might have been connected to some kind of criminal enterprise, a rumor that, predictably, started spreading through the neighborhood's group chats faster than either Rourke or I had any ability to control. I want to pause here and say something that I think matters for anyone watching this who's dealt with their own version of an HOA president deciding, on essentially no evidence, that you're hiding something sinister. It is an enormously isolating experience, even when you objectively know the rumor is wrong and even when, in our particular case, the truth was actually far more significant than anything Marlene was speculating about. I found myself avoiding the community mailbox cluster for almost 2 weeks, timing my errands specifically to avoid running into anyone who might bring it up, because I genuinely didn't know what I was allowed to say in response. Rourke's job requires a level of discretion that made even a simple denial feel complicated, since explaining, "No, we're not criminals, my husband is actually a federal agent," wasn't something either of us could just casually drop into a conversation at the mailbox. The conversation Rourke had warned me about finally happened on a Saturday morning in late March, and it did not go even remotely the way Marlene Diggs expected it to. Marlene showed up at our front door uninvited that Saturday morning, around 10, apparently having decided, on her own initiative, that it was time to address the situation directly, a phrase she actually used, as I'd later learn, in a text message to one of her board allies beforehand. She was dressed for what I can only describe as a performance, a crisp blazer over athletic wear, the kind of outfit that says someone is dressed simultaneously for confrontation and for documenting that confrontation on camera. I answered the door. Rourke was in the kitchen, close enough to hear everything, which I'd later understand was entirely intentional on his part. "Diane, I wanted to come by personally," Marlene said, in a tone that managed to sound simultaneously friendly and faintly threatening, "to let you know that if a replacement vehicle shows up on this property without proper registration, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to a formal hearing and potential lien against your property for accumulated fines. I know this might feel uncomfortable, but rules apply to everyone in this community, regardless of, well, whatever that vehicle was actually for." There was something in the way she said, "whatever that vehicle was actually for," that told me she was still actively fishing, still hoping I'd offer some kind of explanation or, better yet from her perspective, some kind of confession that would validate the rumors she'd been spreading for 2 weeks. "Marlene," I said, "I think you should talk to my husband about this." I stepped back from the door. Rourke walked into the entryway, still in his weekend clothes, nothing about his appearance suggesting anything other than an ordinary guy in jeans and a plain gray t-shirt. Marlene's expression shifted, briefly, into something like mild confusion, the look of someone recalibrating an expectation that didn't quite match what she was seeing. "Mrs. Diggs," Rourke said, his voice carrying the same calm, measured tone I'd heard him use during actual case briefings, the voice that I think is probably one of the most effective tools he has in his entire professional skill set, because it never escalates no matter how the other person reacts. "I understand you had a vehicle removed from this driveway on March 14th. "That's correct, and as I explained to your wife, if there's a replacement vehicle, there won't be a replacement vehicle parked in this driveway in violation of any actual rule, because there never was one to begin with. I'd like to show you something." He held up a federal credential wallet, the kind I'd seen exactly twice in 11 years of marriage, both times in situations serious enough that he felt it necessary to actually produce it rather than simply state his employer. He opened it, holding it steady, giving her enough time to actually read it rather than flash it quickly the way television always shows these things happening. I watched Marlene's face very closely in that moment, because I think it's the part of this entire story that I'll remember most clearly for the rest of my life. There's a specific transformation that happens on a person's face when an assumption they've built an entire confident narrative around collapses all at once, and Marlene's face did exactly that, color draining from it in a way that genuinely looked almost physical, like watching someone's posture deflate without them actually moving. "That vehicle," Rourke continued, his tone never changing, never rising, was an unmarked Bureau surveillance vehicle, assigned to me for an active federal investigation. It contained secured equipment and case materials. When you had it towed without any actual legal basis, contrary to anything in your own HOA's governing documents which, I should mention, I've now had reviewed by counsel and which contain no resident decal requirement whatsoever, you created a significant chain of custody complication for an active federal case. That complication has been documented in a formal incident report. I'd also like you to know that the public Facebook posts you made identifying and photographing that vehicle, along with the speculation you've apparently been sharing with neighbors suggesting some kind of criminal connection, have also been documented, because depending on certain factors still under review, they may constitute a separate concern related to operational security around an active investigation. Marlene said nothing for what felt like a genuinely uncomfortable stretch of silence, standing on our porch with her phone, which I noticed she'd been holding in a way that suggested she might have intended to film this interaction the way she'd apparently filmed the towing, now lowered uselessly at her side. I had no idea, she finally managed. Nobody told me anything. There was no decal, no registration on file, I was just following standard. I understand you weren't aware of what the vehicle actually was. That's not in dispute, and I want to be clear that I'm not here to suggest you intentionally interfered with a federal investigation knowing what it was. What I am here to tell you is that your HOA's governing documents, which I've now read in full, do not actually authorize what you did, and that going forward, any further fines, notices, or public statements regarding this household need to stop immediately, because I have no interest in this becoming a larger situation than it needs to be, but I also won't allow continued harassment of my family over a manufactured rule that doesn't exist in your own bylaws. Marlene left within about 90 seconds of that conversation ending, not saying much beyond a clearly rattled apology that trailed off mid-sentence, climbing into her own car and pulling out of our cul-de-sac considerably faster than the posted neighborhood speed limit, an irony Rourke noted dryly once she was gone. What happened over the following weeks, once word of that conversation inevitably spread through the neighborhood's group chats, faster and with considerably more accuracy than the original rumor had spread, was a complete reversal of the social dynamic Marlene had spent 18 months building. The same neighbors who'd enthusiastically liked her Operation Clean Court post began quietly distancing themselves, several of them, including Phyllis, reaching out directly to apologize for not pushing back harder when the speculation first started. Marlene attempted, for about 2 weeks, to continue functioning as HOA president as though nothing had happened, but the damage to her credibility within the community proved difficult to recover from once people understood the actual facts. A special board meeting was called in April, organized by 3 residents who'd grown increasingly uncomfortable with what they now understood to be a pattern of fabricated rules and aggressive overreach, not just toward us but, once people started comparing notes, toward at least 4 other households who'd received similarly questionable fines and notices during Marlene's tenure. I didn't attend that meeting personally, mostly on Rourke's advice that our continued presence in the public narrative around this would only complicate things, but Phyllis attended and gave me a detailed account afterward. Marlene attempted to defend her record, framing the towing incident as an honest mistake that anyone could have made given the lack of visible registration, but the broader pattern of fabricated parking rules, inconsistent fine enforcement, and what several residents now openly described as a targeted harassment campaign against our household specifically, proved impossible for her to talk her way around. She resigned as HOA president before the meeting concluded, citing, in a brief statement Phyllis described as visibly read from a prepared note rather than spoken naturally, personal reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. The board accepted her resignation immediately, and a temporary president was appointed within the same meeting to oversee a formal review of every fine and violation notice issued during her tenure. Rourke, true to his word, never pursued any further formal action against Marlene personally, beyond the documented incident report that existed primarily to protect the integrity of his own case rather than to punish her. She didn't know what she was towing, he told me one evening, weeks after everything had settled. If she had known and done it anyway, that's a very different situation. She just got high enough on a small amount of unchecked power that she stopped checking her own assumptions before acting on them. That's not a federal crime. That's just an extremely common, extremely human failure mode, and honestly, most people who exercise that kind of unchecked authority over their neighbors eventually run into a version of this, even if it's rarely quite this specific. The community's review of Marlene's tenure, completed over the following 2 months by the new interim board, found that roughly 60% of the fines she'd issued during her time as president had no actual basis in the HOA's governing documents, the same pattern Phyllis's husband, who'd quietly been keeping his own records after receiving a particularly nonsensical landscaping fine the previous fall, had already begun documenting before any of this even happened with us. The board issued refunds, with interest, to every household that had paid a fine later determined to be invalid, totaling just over $4,300 across 11 affected families. I think about that number sometimes, $4,300, spread across 11 households, none of which were ours, because we'd simply ignored most of the early notices rather than paying them. It's a relatively small amount of money in the grand scheme of everything that happened, far smaller than the kind of dramatic financial fraud numbers you hear about in some of these stories, but it represents something I think matters just as much: 11 families who'd quietly absorbed unjustified fines from someone wielding authority she'd essentially invented for herself, simply because nobody had pushed back hard enough, soon enough, to make her actually account for what she was doing. Rourke's investigation, the actual federal case that brought him home that Thursday afternoon in the first place, concluded successfully about 4 months later, resulting in several arrests connected to a multi-state financial fraud scheme that had nothing whatsoever to do with Birchwood Court or Marlene Diggs, beyond the fact that one very ordinary Thursday afternoon, a homeowners association president nearly created an unnecessary complication in an active federal case because she decided, on absolutely no actual evidence, that an unmarked sedan parked in a quiet cul-de-sac was suspicious enough to remove without ever once considering she might be wrong. We still live in Birchwood Court. The new HOA board, led now by Phyllis's husband, who ran unopposed in the special election that followed Marlene's resignation, operates with a noticeably lighter touch, focused on the kind of genuinely reasonable community upkeep that doesn't require inventing rules out of thin air. Rourke's vehicles still rotate through our driveway every few months, unremarkable and unbothered, exactly the way operational security requires them to be. Marlene moved out of Birchwood Court entirely about 8 months after her resignation, selling her house and relocating, according to neighborhood gossip I have no particular reason to doubt, to a different subdivision 2 towns over, one that, as far as anyone's heard, does not currently have an HOA at all. So here's my question for you. Has anyone in your neighborhood ever made a confident, aggressive assumption about you or your family that turned out to be spectacularly wrong? Drop your story in the comments. Let's hear how it played out. And if this story mattered to you, hit that subscribe button, because there are more stories like this coming, stories about people who found out the hard way that confidence isn't the same thing as being right. Next week, a county code enforcement officer tried to condemn a disabled veteran's wheelchair ramp, until the inspector who showed up turned out to be a veteran himself. See you then. And remember, keep your receipts. All of them.